Released in 1946, the plot of Alfred Hitchcock's Notorious follows an American agent pimping out a woman to a Nazi. I'm not even exaggerating here. Hitchcock himself even pitched it to RKO as the story of a woman sold for political purposes into sexual enslavement. If you're like me, this absolutely does not sound like a very promising plot for a film, and yet Notorious is easily one of my favorite Hitchcock movies. It's a pretty explosive movie that sits in sharp contrast to what you might think of when you think of classical Hollywood movies. Something with moral simplicity, like a man in a white hat facing off against a man in a black hat. Notorious is even more fascinating when you compare it to Hitchcock's other Cary Grant starring spy thriller, 1959's North by Northwest. Unlike Notorious, North by Northwest isn't a psychological noir. It's often thought of as the James Bond film before James Bond films even existed. It's playful, exciting, and really fun, but also completely absurd. Even though the vibes are very different, as the kids today might say, Notorious and North by Northwest both feature women in complicated sexual entanglements with both hero and villain, forming something of a perverse love triangle. The hero in each film is played by Cary Grant. In Notorious, he's an agent for an unnamed federal agency, torn between duty and desire. In North by Northwest, he's an advertising executive drawn into the world of espionage after a case of mistaken identity. The villains are played by Claude Rains and James Mason, each man representing the foreign threat to the United States at the time each movie was made. One's a fascist, one's a communist, both are affably evil? Then there's Ingrid Bergman and Eva Marie Saint, in love with our hero, but pushed into the villain's bed by the US government for the purposes of espionage. Under the strictness of the production code's rules, the sex is never made explicit, but it's there, and it's not exactly the subtlest subtext Hitchcock ever did. These movies leave no doubt that the characters played by Bergman and Saint are putting their bodies on the line for men's use and pleasure in the name of national security. Both movies are simultaneously titillated and disgusted by this. Notorious and North by Northwest also mark the starting point and ending point of a period in American history where popular conceptions of identity and patriotism curdled into fanaticism and paranoia. Depicting the government as pimping out a woman stands in stark contrast to how the United States wanted to be depicted during this period. And as we'll see, the hero acting against the government's wishes to save his love interest from a terrible fate is a sneakily radical act. In this video, we'll explore the similarities and differences between Notorious and North by Northwest, how the movies managed to depict sexual activities as critical to the plot at a time when sex was prohibited on screen, how both movies fit in with Alfred Hitchcock's filmography and his other depictions of women, and what these movies say about fear and the American foreign threat. The production code, which set the terms for Hollywood censorship, was adopted in 1930 to be administered and enforced by the Production Code Administration, a department within the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America, later known as the Motion Picture Association of America, or the MPAA. However, it wasn't strictly enforced until 1934, when Joseph Breen became the PCA's leader, creating a 4-year pre-code era of filmmaking that generally allowed for looser depictions of sex, violence, queerness, religious elements, and so on and so forth. The production code's intent was to ensure that no picture shall be produced which will lower the moral standards of those who see it, that the correct standards of life shall be preserved, and that law, natural or human, shall not be ridiculed, nor shall sympathy be created for its violation. So, if your character is a criminal, they're not to be portrayed sympathetically, nor shall methods of crime be explicitly portrayed. The sanctity of marriage needs to be upheld, so adultery and illicit sex, while sometimes necessary for a movie's plot, must not be explicitly shown, justified, or presented attractively. Scenes of passion should only be used when the plot demands it, and there should be no excessive and lustful kissing, lustful embraces, nor shall suggestive postures and gestures be shown. Quote-unquote sex perversion, meaning queer relationships and sex, is forbidden. But the production code doesn't just cover crime and sex. White slavery is forbidden. Scenes of childbirth are forbidden. Miscegenation or interracial relationships, quote, must be treated within the careful limits of good taste. No film may ridicule any religious faith. Profanity, vulgarity, and obscenity are all prohibited, and the production code even includes a list of banned words, like cripes, as in a euphemism for Christ, hot when used as an adjective for a woman, or tart. The production code was racist and homophobic, but the studio heads went along with it because they were capitalists intent on achieving wealth and respectable success. There were enough religious and women's groups who had been agitating against Hollywood's low moral standards and threatening boycotts, thereby creating financial risks. A number of politicians had started to take notice as well, and federal censorship was becoming a looming possibility under Franklin Roosevelt, with a bipartisan coalition in Congress contemplating legislation to create a federal censorship bureau. In fact, Eleanor Roosevelt's debut radio broadcast in 1934 was not dedicated to hyping up New Deal policies or discussing the rise of fascism in Europe, but was instead dedicated to talking about movie censorship's importance to women and children and her happiness with Joseph Breen's appointment. There are production code apologists, though, who argue that this in-house censorship regime facilitated the artistic creativity and industrial efficiency of what is now known as the golden age of Hollywood. After all, business was up and troubles were down, but as noted in the book, Movie Censorship and American Culture, most of the clergymen, reformers, and politicians who took aim at Hollywood were intent not on wrecking the dream machine, but on coming to terms with the most popular medium of communication and persuasion in their world, and thereby securing their own cultural authority and political power. In a way, the plots of Notorious and North by Northwest each hinge on a woman jumping from one bed to another, and both movies are fascinating examples of how filmmakers had to navigate the production code in depicting a kind of subtextual sexual frankness. As noted by John Bilheimer in his book Hitchcock and the Censors, Notorious was among the few Hitchcock movies that were actually improved through the limits of the production code. In the movie, Alicia Huberman, the American daughter of a Nazi spy, is recruited by T.R. Devlin to infiltrate a circle of German expatriates living in Rio de Janeiro after World War II. She and Devlin fall in love, but then they learn the true nature of her assignment. Alicia is to seduce Alexander Sebastian, a friend of her father's and the leader of the Nazi spy ring, so that she can be in his home and in his confidence and find out what he's up to. In an early script of the movie, Ingrid Bergman's Alicia was a prostitute who was supposed to die at the end of the movie, punishment for being an immoral woman and a life of loose living. Joseph Breen had concerns about Alicia's compensating moral values, and he made suggestions about how the filmmakers could make Alicia more likable, specifically establishing that Alicia is a lady who lives by her wits. A gold digger perhaps, but not specifically a prostitute. It was agreed that her character would be changed in such a way to avoid any direct inference that she is a woman of loose sex morals. One of Breen's lieutenants, Jeffrey Sherlock, wrote in a memo that screenwriter Ben Hecht had indicated that future drafts would leave Alicia alive at the end of the movie, her survival being absolutely necessary to avoid any suggestion of sex promiscuity or looseness on her part. The PCA had further dialogue changes they wanted to make, including removing a bit about how Alicia was a tramp ready to die for her country. I, for one, am glad that the uproar over sexual promiscuity made it so that Alicia survived the movie and that the script was generally less abusive towards her. Joseph Breen also suggested that the script indicate that Alex was once in love with Alicia. The thinking was that this would make her mission less distasteful and omit all innuendo as to her previous character. This also is, weirdly enough, a fantastic suggestion from Breen, a major upgrade from Alex being just some random man, And, as we'll discuss in a moment, this paves the way for a truly disorienting villainous turn from Claude Rains. Then, there was the matter of depicting Alicia and Devlin's love affair in Rio. Hitchcock worked around the production code restrictions on excessive and lustful kissing to create a sense of a ménage à trois between Bergman, Grant, and the viewer. Most directors understood excessive and lustful kissing to mean kisses lasting over 3 seconds. And so Hitchcock constructed a really lovely and very intimate sequence where Alicia and Devlin make dinner plans while kissing, nuzzling at each other's faces, never leaving each other's arms, and maintaining eye contact. The whole thing came in at 2 minutes, 40 seconds, a bit of passionate love play that made it past the censors to become one of the most famous screen kisses of all time. The script for North by Northwest also ran afoul of the Production Code Administration for sexual reasons. North by Northwest is kind of a complicated yarn, but just know that it follows Roger Thornhill, an advertising executive who's mistaken for a government super spy and pulled into a confrontation with the mysterious Philip Van Damme. Framed for murder, Roger goes on the run, encountering Eve Kendall. They hook up, it's revealed she's Van Damme's mistress, Roger survives assassination via crop duster plane attack, and then, in a second twist, Roger learns Eve's also spying on Van Damme for the government and has to help protect her cover. By the time 1959 had rolled around, Joseph Breen was retired, the PCA now overseen by Jeffrey Sherlock. Sherlock was more accommodating to the studios, especially when dealing with directors whom he admired, like Alfred Hitchcock. Still, Sherlock had his concerns. There was the matter of Roger's 2 ex-wives, which was thought to be gratuitous and something that would be off-putting to Catholic viewers. The script contained allusions to the possibility that Leonard, Van Damme's main henchman, played by Martin Landau, was gay. I think Landau is really striking in this movie. He's handsome, but he has kind of a bug-eyed menace about him. At a TCM event in 2010, Landau said he did indeed play Leonard as a gay man, jealous of Eve's relationship with Van Damme, and a little too eager to prove her disloyalty to his boss. Landau said Hitchcock never gave him any specific direction to play it that way, it was just something he had picked up from the script through lines like,
"Call it my woman's intuition, if you will."
The result is a performance that's not stereotypically offensive. It's subtle enough that Leonard's motivations probably went over the heads of most viewers who, again, no thanks to the production code, were not used to seeing queer characters on screen. But like Notorious, the PCA was also concerned with the implication that Eve is Van Damme's mistress, suggesting that Hitchcock omit any hint that Eve Kendall might be a woman of loose morals. Sherlock also took note of a line of dialogue said by Eve when she's seducing Roger on the 20th Century Limited train. He noted, the girl's line, "I never make love on an empty stomach," is unacceptably sex-suggestive, and the exchange should simply be omitted. Hitchcock finished principal photography in December 1958 and then somehow managed to satisfy the PCA's concerns through January and February 1959, retaining the majority of the original script and the footage he had already shot. You can see this in the final product. Roger's 2 ex-wives remained, Leonard's line about his woman's intuition remained, but in the train scene with Roger, Eve's dialogue doesn't match what her mouth is saying. The line that the PCA objected to was changed from "make love on an empty stomach" to "discuss love on an empty stomach."
Is that a proposition?
I never discuss love on an empty stomach.
This line was changed to retain the suggestion that Roger and Eve hook up in her train compartment on the way to Chicago, while simultaneously keeping it less explicit. So while the PCA's concerns were managed, there's also a couple bits of provocative dialogue and action that Sherlock somehow let slide. There's Eve's proposition on the train. There's also the fact that Roger and Eve kiss at one point for 16 seconds, blowing past the 3-second rule Hitchcock had so effectively worked around in Notorious. Then there's the outrageously suggestive final scene and shot with Roger and Eve together on the train, now happily married and lustily reclining together on the train bed when their train enters a tunnel. Despite the PCA insisting that Roger and Eve be in their day clothes for this final scene, somehow, in the final product, Eve looks like she's in pajamas. Sherlock also insisted that the couple not dip below a 45-degree angle as they lay back on the bed together, which Hitchcock honored, even though you can find production stills where Grant and Saint are pretty much laying down flat. In the script reviewed by the PCA, the final shot of the movie was described as a shot toward the end of the observation car as the train rolls off into the night. Just before the movie's final negative was completed, Hitchcock requested footage of a train entering a tunnel, sneaking in one of the cheekiest sexual innuendos made during the production code age. Hitchcock later said, "There are no symbols in North by Northwest." Oh yes, one! The last shot, the train entering the tunnel after the love scene between Grant and Eva Marie Saint. It's a phallic symbol, but don't tell anyone. Of course, the 3-second kisses and 45-degree angles seem absolutely ridiculous when compared to movies today, but this was how Hollywood operated for over 30 years. The death of the production code was slow. In 1952, movies received First Amendment protection after New York censors banned distribution of The Miracle, an Italian film by Roberto Rossellini. More on Roberto Rossellini in a moment. Film boycotts by Catholic groups in particular lost strength, becoming less of a threat to a movie's box office success. European movies challenged American audiences with boundary-pushing material. And Hollywood directors like Otto Preminger, Sidney Lumet, Mike Nichols, Billy Wilder, and Alfred Hitchcock himself began to put out movies that teased or outright blew past the code's limits on violent sex and foul language, with or without production code administration approval. Enforcement of the production code became impossible, and on November 1st, 1968, the production code was officially supplanted by an alphabet rating system. Rather than ensuring that every movie would not lower the audience's moral standards, the MPAA would provide guidance and let viewers choose for themselves. Although the original ratings have changed and new ones have been added, this is still the framework that the United States has in place to this day. So, if the production code mandates that illicit sex can't be in any way presented attractively, how do you accomplish this even if the audience is kind of excited by what they're seeing? Ultimately, the movie has to send a message to the audience about the horrible consequences that could happen to them if they go down the same road. In the case of women who have illicit sex, you often get movies where they're killed or arrested or discarded in some way. Take, for example, one of the most notable femme fatales in film noir, Phyllis Dietrichson in Double Indemnity, who gets shot and killed for her provocative schemes. Either because of these larger cultural messages, or maybe because of his own outlook and obsessions, Hitchcock tends to punish women in his movies if they have sex, or even if they just fall in love with a man, whether it's getting strangled by a stranger at a carnival, or falling out of a mission bell tower, or being stabbed to death in the shower. Hitchcock and women have a charged and controversial history, both on and off screen. Sometimes his characters are outright misogynists.
Horrible. Faded, fat, greedy women.
But they're alive, they're human beings.
Are they?
But sometimes it's not just the characters, it's the movie as a whole, which often seem to indicate an animus against women, and specifically against the female body. His female characters reflected his own views on women as foolish, capriciously sensual, and at the mercy of wildly improbable sexual urges. And so they are submitted to excruciating ordeals, long trips through terror in which they may be raped, violated by birds, killed. This resentment also bleeds into stories about Hitchcock's personal life, how he treated the leading ladies who worked on his movies. There's anecdotes of sadistic behavior, public humiliation, rough treatment, and, in the case of Tippi Hedren, a full-on campaign of sexual harassment.
Of course, in addition to being in practically every sequence of Marnie, then the situation became really, really intolerable, didn't it?
It did. Yeah, it did. I don't know if any of you women have had the horrible experience of being the object of someone's obsession. If you have, you would know exactly what that is like, and it is oppressive and frightening, and you find out that you've been followed, and you find out that your handwriting has been analyzed, and you find out that you're being spied upon and made demands that you would never acquiesce under any circumstance.
There is, as one critic put it, a sense of disturbance in his movies. Depending on your approach, it's easy to come away thinking the man was a misogynist, that his movies are just an exercise in female suffering. It's because of this that Hitchcock was pretty important to the development of feminist film theory. Laura Mulvey's seminal academic essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, focuses on Hitchcock's movies to show how women in classic Hollywood movies are made into passive objects of male voyeuristic and sadistic impulses. By implication, female filmgoers can only have a masochistic relationship to film. This is the idea of the male gaze. I think movies and our relationship to them as spectators is a little more complicated than this, and I'm fairly confident, based on my own personal experiences, that watching a movie as a woman isn't just a twisted exercise in enduring pain and suffering. Hitchcock does have his defenders, of course, critics who argue that Hitchcock's movies demonstrate a sympathy towards women and their plight under patriarchy. As Robin Wood notes, there are contradictions in his movies, which has the effect of calling into question, and in some cases disrupting beyond all possible recuperation, the male drives and fantasies that provide the film's initial impulse. Think, for example, of Vertigo. How can anyone watch that movie and not walk away thinking that Scotty was one sick puppy? I mean, his fantasy in this movie is so utterly depraved. How can you not feel sympathy for Judy? I find Notorious and North by Northwest fascinating because you can see both perspectives at work. That Hitchcock was a misogynist intent on punishing women, and that he was also sympathetic to their mistreatment by the men around them. In The Women Who Knew Too Much, Hitchcock and Feminist Theory, Tanya Modleski posits that Notorious is a remix of a genre known as the female gothic, or the gothic romance film, but with a film noir twist. Gothic romance movies, which became popular during World War II when women dominated domestic viewing markets on the home front, follow a female protagonist who falls in love or gets married to a man, then comes to fear him for some reason or another. As Richard Allen put it, his brooding behavior is a source of attraction because he is someone ripe for emotional rescue if only his secret could be understood, but also an incipient threat to the heroine. Put another way, he's like an homme fatale. The heroine becomes the movie's central investigative force, trying to discover the man's secrets or confirm whether he's actually out to harm her. These movies acknowledge female anxieties and fears, particularly fear of men, and offer a female-centered alternative to another genre that became prominent during World War II, film noir, where the man is always the investigative force, and the femme fatale is typically eroticized and threatening, a projection of post-war male anxiety and male desire. We can see the female gothic in Hitchcock's Rebecca, Suspicion, and Spellbound, all one-word titles where a young woman becomes romantically involved with a handsome, dangerous stranger. Shadow of a Doubt switches the romantic for the familial and follows a teenage girl who discovers that her beloved uncle is a serial killer of older, wealthy widows. In Notorious, Alicia fears both her lover and the man who becomes her eventual husband. Devlin is intimidated by Alicia's reputation as someone who likes to party, drink, and have flings with various men. She's the notorious woman that the film's title alludes to, and he's unable to reconcile his love for her and the mission he has to convince her to undertake. As a result, he acts really terribly, and he makes a constant stream of underhanded remarks towards her. She agrees to seduce Alex to please Devlin, only to believe she's being rejected and abandoned by the man she loves. Alex loves Alicia, and she's so successful in the seduction that he proposes marriage. The Americans convince her to agree to him, but Alex eventually realizes that his wife's been spying on him, and he lets his mother convince him that they need to poison Alicia. So yeah, he tries to kill her. In the Gothic tradition, the movie creates empathy for Alicia and has her as the investigative force, poking around Alex's household. We spend a lot of time following her. We know her backstory and why she acts the way she does. The movie also frequently cuts to her point of view, like when she's hungover and talking to Devlin, or when she realizes her husband and mother-in-law are trying to kill her, and we're meant to share in her confusion and panic. Then comes the third act switch. In a move reminiscent of film noir, the movie changes perspective from Alicia to Devlin. He has to figure out what's happened to her, and he becomes the investigative force. He discovers she's being poisoned, brought to the brink of death, and so, in addition to the empathy, we also get the punishment. It's the two facets of Hitchcock, that same sense of disturbance. Eve's situation is slightly different from Alicia's. Her relationship with Van Damme was something she was in consensually, and then she was approached by the professor, a spy master for an unnamed American agency played by Leo G. Carroll. Only then was she asked to spy on Van Damme. North by Northwest also doesn't lean into the female Gothic as closely as Notorious does. If anything, it has a touch of the male Gothic, with Roger becoming afraid of Eve. We don't follow Eve's perspective as closely as we do Alicia's, and she occupies a more traditional femme fatale role. However, we get the hints of stress and fear. Eve is also viciously attacked by Roger at multiple points after he learns of her deception towards him, called a treacherous little tramp, accused of being someone who uses sex like a fly swatter. And if you're like me, Roger's comments feel way out of bounds. I think that's the movie's attitude as well, because Roger quickly backpedals when he learns the full story. Even if Eve's not the investigative force of the movie, we still empathize with her. Eve's also punished. Like Alicia, she's almost killed, something that's partially brought on by the government's total lack of concern for her. Oh, Van Damme's gonna throw you out a plane! Well, maybe you should have thought of that before you fucked a communist. Both women are degraded by men, both are sexually exploited by the government, both are nearly brought to death because of it. But I don't think this is some niche feminist interpretation of these movies. Through the empathetic touches, the audience is meant to know this and understand how unfair it is that Alicia and Eve are being mistreated under a callous patriarchy. Both actresses totally kill it, and both movies were part of a kind of apex period in each of their careers. Eva Marie Saint won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress in 1954 for her very first movie role in Elia Kazan's On the Waterfront, and she's part of an illustrious group of actresses who won for their debuts. She would take on less and less movie roles after North by Northwest to spend more time with her husband and 2 children, appearing in less than 20 movies between 1955 and 2006, focusing mostly on television. At age 93, she recently made an appearance at the 2018 Oscars to give out the award for costume design, where she looked absolutely incredible. I mean, Eva Marie, please share your secrets. Ingrid Bergman is, of course, Ingrid Bergman, which is to say she's luminous and able to do so much with just a look or a single line. Notorious was a major departure for her wholesome, good girl star persona, but her career would be sent into a tailspin 3 years later by one of the major sex scandals of the 20th century, when news broke that she was leaving her husband, Dr. Peter Lindstrom, for Italian director Roberto Rossellini, by whom she was pregnant. The YouTuber Be Kind Rewind has a really great video on the scandal and how it affected Bergman and the trajectory of her career, which I'll link to below. But just know that when her squeaky clean star persona collided with the reality of her personal life, the reaction was swift and severe. Senator Edwin C. Jackson, a Democrat from Colorado, even condemned her in the Senate as one of the most powerful women on earth. I regret to say, a powerful influence for evil. Just like in the movies, women in the real world are punished and condemned for perceived sexual impropriety. Unlike Notorious and North by Northwest, there's hardly ever an effort in the real world to elicit sympathy for the woman for us to understand just how brutally unfair her mistreatment is. If there is sympathy, it usually comes much later. Another thing that Notorious and North by Northwest have in common is that the villain in each movie represents the major foreign threat to America at the time it was made. And in spite of this, each guy remains a somewhat likable presence throughout the movie until their own cowardice gets them in the end. Hitchcock loved sympathetic or charming villains. Quote, "In the old days, villains had mustaches and kicked the dog. Audiences are smarter today. They don't want their villain to be thrown at them with green limelight on his face. They want an ordinary human being with failings." And when you think about the Hitchcockian villain, the ordinary human being with failings, it doesn't get much better than Alexander Sebastian. If the Gothic/noir hybrid in Notorious changes our perspective and twists who we identify with, this kind of rupture is also facilitated by Alex. You can see that in almost every article about this movie. People find him gentlemanly, strangely vulnerable, the only character with any claim to virtue, which is an absolutely deranged thing to say about a Nazi, and yet Claude Rains kind of makes it work. Critics share in Alex's betrayal, especially when he's been so upfront about his emotions and feelings with Alicia. As I saw one writer put it, he is victimized nearly as much as Alicia, and doubly victimized when he submits to the power of Mother again. As Roger Ebert wrote in his 1997 review of Notorious, by the time all the pieces are in place, we actually feel more sympathy for Sebastian than for Devlin. He may be a spy, but he loves Alicia sincerely, while Devlin may be an American agent, but he has used Alicia's love to force her into the arms of another man. Look, I get it, that it sucks to be so honest and open with someone only to have them betray you, but he's not victimized more than Alicia, nor is he virtuous. I mean, has everyone lost their damn minds? We're told that Alex is an executive with Farben, the largest corporation in Europe during World War II. Notorious came out in September 1946, less than a year before the start of the IG Farben trial in August 1947, as one of the subsequent Nuremberg trials, where 24 corporate directors were tried for various crimes, 13 of whom went to prison, and the Allied Control Council broke Farben up into the constituent companies that had formed the chemical and pharmaceutical conglomerate. Farben's World War II activities were heinous and included using concentration camp slave labor, participating in medical experiments on prisoners, seizing property in Poland, Norway, and France, and manufacturing Zyklon B. So, Alex is a Nazi war criminal and profiteer, and oh yeah, he's trying to pretty much keep that going by obtaining a nuclear bomb? That's a plot point that certainly would have upped the paranoia for contemporary audiences. The mansion, the clothing, the jewelry, they all come from an incredibly evil and grotesque source. He also, again, tries to murder his wife. But I also sort of understand where these critics are coming from. I find Claude Rains to be a pretty appealing actor. He's one of my underrated faves from this era, probably because I have a soft spot for character actors who come in with a heat check performance and absolutely body the material every time. As he entered his 50s, Rains particularly excelled at a character type I can only really describe as likable scumbag major slut. Take Captain Renault in Casablanca, which, if you haven't seen it, is one of those movies that truly lives up to the hype.
I'm shocked to find that gambling is going on in here.
You're winning, sir.
Oh, thank you very much. Everybody out at once.
This joke never fails to make me laugh or smile, and Renault is so likable, but he's also extorting refugees for sex. Likable scumbag major slut. 1946's Deception is not a very good movie, but it kind of reminds me of one of my favorites, Phantom Thread, in that both movies are about the struggle of being the lover of a wealthy and prominent man who constantly acts like a little bitch. All together now, likable scumbag major slut. Alexander Sebastian is like the serious version of the likable scumbag major slut. The guy is love blind. He's clearly not thinking with his head. At the beginning, he's really nice to Alicia, and his love for her does feel more genuine than Devlin's, who spends the majority of the movie acting distant. He makes no cruel comments about Alicia's honor. Ultimately, he is pushed into poisoning her by his domineering and emasculating mother, very effectively played here by Austrian actress Leopoldine Konstantin in her only American role. The nightmarish mother is, of course, a character archetype that Hitchcock often used and took to freakish extremes in Psycho, but this is actually the first time the mother factors into one of his movies on screen. So, I really cannot stretch to call this guy sympathetic, but it's certainly a charming and disorienting performance, and it was Rains' fourth and final Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor. James Mason's character in North by Northwest is also motivated by politics. That movie is far foggier about what exactly those politics are, although the popular understanding, given the time period, is that Philip Van Damme is a communist. But even though the movie doesn't make that communism overt, we know that Van Damme heads some type of criminal organization and he smuggles government secrets out of the country. And that's good enough to be a villain, right? Like Alexander Sebastian, Philip Van Damme is cultured, charming, and generally pretty nice to his mistress. Mason has one of the most recognizable accents in movie history, and it's pretty delicious to listen to him delivering Bond villain one-liners and put-downs to Cary Grant.
Seems to me you fellows could stand a little less training from the FBI and a little more from the actor's studio.
Apparently, the only performance that'll satisfy you is when I play dead.
In your very next role, you'll be quite convincing, I assure you.
Also like Alexander Sebastian, Van Damme stays somewhat likable by having his worst, most violent impulses outsourced to a third party. With Sebastian, it's his scary mother. With Van Damme, it's his chief henchman Leonard and an assortment of lesser minions. In some books and articles I've read, there seems to be confusion about whether Van Damme intentionally pimped out Eve to Roger as a means of luring him to his death. But I don't think that's the case. His reaction in the auction house scene when Roger basically slut-shames poor Eve seems to suggest that he didn't know Eve was going to have sex with Roger. This is also confirmed by the professor's later comments that Eve had put herself under suspicion by entering into an association with Roger, who was believed to be a government agent. Eve probably just wanted to hook up with Roger. I mean, it's Cary Grant, why not? As she says, he does have a nice face. Alex and Van Damme are representative of the villainy of ideas, bookends on a period of intense paranoia in American culture over the bomb and McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee. The MacGuffins in each movie, wine bottles filled with uranium ore and a statue filled with microfilm, reflect real-world developments and only reinforced audiences' fears about each threat to America. For Notorious, Hitchcock claimed that he and screenwriter Ben Hecht followed up on rumors of special explosive devices and German heavy water research with various researchers in early 1945, well before the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This development research, according to Hitchcock, ended up getting him placed under FBI surveillance, although Hitchcock biographer Donald Spoto argues that this was probably just an embellished story Hitchcock liked to tell because there's no record of him being under surveillance in FBI files. Spotto also suggests that this story, which kind of frames Hitchcock as some kind of atomic bomb prophet, doesn't really jive with the Notorious filming schedule, which started in October 1945 and probably meant the uranium plot device was added in later on to reflect real-world events. In North by Northwest, Roger refers to the statue containing the microfilm as the pumpkin, which seems to be a reference to the Pumpkin Papers, a set of leaked federal government documents, also including microfilm documents, which factored prominently into the trial of Alger Hiss, the State Department employee who was accused of being a Soviet spy. The documents were named the Pumpkin Papers because ex-communist courier Whittaker Chambers had kept the rolls of microfilm hidden in a hollowed-out pumpkin. So yeah, each movie seems designed to prey upon a contemporary viewer's fear of America's fascist and communist enemies, but weirdly enough, these are also movies where the American government comes off as awfully villainous. As we've discussed, the plot of both movies hinge on the government pimping out a woman for the sake of espionage and putting her life in danger. This is gross and exploitive, and both movies, particularly Notorious, know how fucked up it is, how perverse it is to have boardrooms of men patting each other on the back over information obtained through such dubious methods. In Notorious, Cary Grant was originally supposed to be an FBI agent, but J. Edgar Hoover, of all people, did not like the idea of a movie showing FBI agents coaxing a woman into prostitution, and so Devlin's agency is unnamed. The male lead in each movie really only begins to act heroically when he tells the government to get bent and decides he's going to derail the intelligence operation to rescue his love interest himself. This is particularly explicit in North by Northwest. Leo G. Carroll's professor is an unfeeling bureaucrat who's perfectly willing to send Eve off to her death. We don't know what agency he works for, but since Carroll was styled to look a little bit like Alan Dule, we can safely assume it's the CIA. Towards the end of the movie, Roger tells him off and ignores his instructions to let Eve go.
War is hell, Mr. Thornhill, even when it's a cold one.
If you fellas can't lick the Van Dams of this world without asking girls like her to bed down with them and fly away with them and probably never come back, perhaps you ought to start learning how to lose a few Cold Wars.
This feels kind of radical for a movie made during the height of the Cold War and a period in which American culture really abided by an ethos of conformity. It's almost like a precursor to the cynicism about the United States and its institutions that would begin to saturate movies during the New Hollywood era, after numerous political assassinations, the Vietnam War, and Watergate. If movies bring together the political and the personal, channeled through a director's own outlook and obsessions, Notorious and North by Northwest are both an effortless merger of those realms. It's really fascinating that these two movies mirror each other so closely. But then again, maybe these kinds of parallels are to be expected. Thanks for watching. Bye!